Hi there, I am Kululwa Mutwa and welcome to today's episode of Property Market Moves. In today's session, we speak about private equity and infrastructure funding. And I am sitting with Ms. Tshepiso Kobile. How are you?
I'm well.
Yeah?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good to be back home.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You know, when I saw you at the inner city session, it just felt so natural, you know, that this is her home, this is her space.
Yes. So looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Yes. So before we dive into it, who's Tshepiso?
Ooh, that question is always so loaded, right?
I know.
Because I think for myself, I always have to think about, do I respond on the basis of what I do, which is not really who I am, right?
Yeah.
Or do I respond on the basis of what gives me life? What makes me feel like a human being on this earth?
Yeah. I like the second one.
Yes. So I think at my core, I am a human being that is going through this life, grateful for this life, that grew up in the mountainous region of Lesotho.
Okay.
And I was reminded of that because we went there for Easter. And on the drive there, looking at the mountains, the scenery, the poverty, which always just breaks my heart, I was reminded that, you know, we achieve so much, but we leave so many behind. So I think that was a very important reminder for me that I'm a village girl who spent a lot of her childhood in the township, then suburbia, then moved around a bit because my schooling was done in the Eastern Cape and then tertiary in the Western Cape. And then started working in Gauteng. And then in the last 10 years, I lived in KZN. So I don't associate with myself with a specific geographical space, but I think of myself as an African child.
No,
also
absolutely.
A mother. Who's also a mother to a 10-year-old.
Okay.
And as a professional, I think of myself as a professional who is always looking for a way to use her skills to transform society spatially and economically, and has found a way to do that through property finance, project finance, etc.
Okay. That's loaded, and I agree with you. It's always such a complicated one. Do I talk about my career? Do I talk about, me as a person? So now if we get into the work that you do, how did you find yourself there?
So I found myself there, and in fact, I must actually attribute some of this to SAIBPP, because I think SAIBPP woke me up or made me more conscious of the world of advocacy. And so when the SAFKA opportunity came, I was already very conscious to the role that industry bodies play as advocates and as platforms for representing the collective. Because ultimately the role that industry players play in our society, and that's what I do. I lead an organization called SAVCA, which is the Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. And at their core, industry bodies are there to go and advocate for the bigger group. Because if you think about the SAIBPP environment or even the SAFKA environment, we have got members in the form of private equity fund managers, private debt fund managers, and venture capital fund managers who realistically can't go there and have a voice with regulators, policymakers, and therefore need a body that will go and advocate on their behalf for an enabling regulatory environment. They need a body that will go out there and spread the message around why this asset class is important in our society. And I'll get into a little bit of that. They need a body that will go out there and capacitate different players to invest in the asset class. So we capacitate them through training, research on the industry. We capacitate them through thought leadership pieces that help them understand why it's important for them to invest in this industry.
Yeah.
And we also create those opportunities for them to get closer to investors. And that is something that would, if left to them by themselves, require a lot of resources, require a lot of time, which means they can't then allocate time to their normal day-to-day activities. So I represent SAFKA as the CEO. It's an industry body that has over 200 members in the form of fund managers, as I've said, as well as professional service providers that provide professional services to the industry. So those would be your law firms, your fund administration companies, your banks, etc. And collectively, our member base has assets under management of over 200 billion rand. So it's a big industry that has a big role to play in our economy.
So what distinguishes private equity in funding projects in comparison to the traditional, funding?
So I would say that as an asset class, what's particularly important to understand about private equity is that by its nature, it's investment in unlisted assets or private companies, right? And it is a mechanism where you've got fund managers who go out there and basically mobilize our savings. They mobilize pension savings, they mobilize insurance capital, they mobilize DFI capital, they pool it together and they channel that capital into businesses in our environment that are not listed. And why that is important is because if one looks at, for example, the trajectory that we've taken as a country and what you see on the stock exchange in South Africa, and you look at the makeup of those companies, the local ownership of those companies, it has dwindled over time, but also even the number of listed companies is almost half what it was a number of years ago. So what you're seeing there is this lower volumes in terms of listed companies. So you suddenly have this asset class that allows investors exposure into industries that they can't access through the stock exchange. Industries that ultimately represent high growth sectors, innovative sectors, real asset sectors that they don't have access to on the stock exchange. So what makes it particularly important is that firstly, it provides risk capital, which is important in the South African environment or any environment. But also in addition to providing risk capital, private equity fund managers are also active owners. They don't just give capital and sit passively. They actually are in there. They roll up their sleeves. They are almost strategic partners to the business owners, and they work with them around strategy, around governance, putting in the right governance systems, giving them access to networks, making them think about growth pathways. So they're a partner for businesses, which also makes our local businesses resilient, and they're giving capital where it's needed the most, which is for growth. A lot of our businesses need if you look at private capital, where it plays in our environment, whereas in the development markets, it's more in the buyouts, and others here in South Africa, it's growth capital, whereas SMEs who are saying we need to now take on the next growth chapter, and they'll look to private equity to do that.
In property development, in the space of property development, how do private equity partners, generally structure the deal? You've spoken to, them getting their sleeves, up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty in the deal, so they don't just give you money and walk away. But in that structuring, how does it typically work in property development?
So the standard PE structure, and when I say PE, I'm not limiting myself to just private equity, because it would work even with venture capital, etc. But the standard structure is what they call an uncommandeed structure or vehicle, where in the structure you've got GPs or general partners,
Okay.
who are the investors that I was speaking about earlier. So they are bringing capital into the structure. And then you've got what we call limited partners. So your limited partners are your investors, right? And they're limited in terms of the role that they play in the day-to-day of the structure. And then you've got the general partners, the GPs, who then will manage the fund. They'll provide investment management services. They're the ones who will go out there and raise the capital. They are the ones who will go and find opportunities, like property development opportunities or businesses that the fund will invest in. So they build this pipeline. And then they raise the capital. Once they've raised the capital and it's sufficient capital, they then deploy capital into this pipeline of projects. In the deployment of that capital, they might, say, take an equity stake in an SPV that is undertaking a development. So they do take development risk. Or they might, for example, take capital in a company that acquires completed properties from property developers that are looking to sell, and then that company is going to own the property for income producing purposes. They might, through the fund, provide private debt, so as mezzanine financing to private developers, which private developers then use for construction, for development, for acquisition, etc. They also might invest in intermediaries, like a company that provides financial products to the industry. So you might find, for example, that you've got a private equity fund that then invests in a company that's providing mortgage finance, or that's providing those types of services to the industry. So they take various forms. And also in terms of how they invest, you'll find that you've got private equity funds that take a sectoral focus. So you might find a fund whose mandate is to invest in residential or to invest in commercial, but there are also sector agnostic funds where it's a fund that will invest in any opportunity, provided that that opportunity is going to yield the required returns for its investors. And so in that sense, very flexible. You also find impact funds. And that impact fund will ultimately be looking for impact. So that impact might come from the education sector, the health sector, the residential sector, etc. So there's quite a lot of scope in terms of how they can play in the property sphere.
Geez, and from a SAFKA membership, I mean, that big amount that is under management, right, of the members of SAFKA. How much of that plays in the property sector?
I won't have exact amounts from an
like a percentage
asset under management or a percentage point of view. And that's really because we don't always know how much has been raised and how much has been deployed. So we will measure at a point in time once a year. And our last study was as at 2023, what the AUM looked like for our member base broadly. But there are quite a number of property or private equity real estate funds, fund managers. And what I like is that they also touch different sectors and different areas within private equity. So there are some who are focusing more on social housing. There are some who are focusing more on township malls. There are some who are focusing more on the prop tech space and what's happening there. And then there are some who are acquiring a portfolio of property assets, industrial, commercial, for income purposes. So there's quite a broad representation, but it can still grow.
Okay. And when we look at the regulatory environment, I mean, how is that enabling or inhibiting in terms of participation, and I would say maybe particularly Black players in your space?
Let me think about that. I wouldn't say that the regulatory environment is particularly constraining. And I say that because I think what we've seen in recent years is that the regulators have passed on regulations that actually create scope for more capital to flow into private equity. So with the passing of the amendments to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, the thresholds that could now be invested by pension funds into private equity were increased to 15%, which means the regulator was saying, as a regulator, the ultimate objective really is to make sure that pension funds are able to diversify their asset base. And I think that's really what was underpinning the amendments to Reg 28. So in so doing, some thresholds for some asset classes were increased.
Sure.
Like they can now invest in private equity to the tune of 15%. They can now invest in infrastructure and a percentage has been set for that.
Yeah.
There's also percentages that have been set for how much can be invested offshore versus inshore. There's also percentages set around how much can be invested in property. There's a cap, in fact, for property. I think it's 25%, to say up to 25% can be invested in property. But importantly, although there's a allocation or a maximum cap for property, there's also private equity funds that invest in property. So that's what I'm saying. I think the regulator has actually created scope for more to be done by pension funds, but we're not seeing a lot of those allocations happen. And there are a number of reasons for it. I think part of the biggest reason, or the biggest reason in my mind, is the fact that over a number of years, pension funds have invested more in the listed space. They've come to understand it, know how it behaves, how it's reported on is different from private businesses who don't necessarily put out their financials out there for the world and info. So information isn't as widely available about when it comes to unlisted types of investments, but still, there's still scope for more allocations to happen, both for private equity as well as for property or real estate, because the regulators have actually made it possible for that to happen. And also, recently there was Operation Vulindlela's conference. I think it was last week, if I recall. And if one looks at what has been done successfully when in the first round of the reforms that were introduced by Operation Vulindlela, we saw there, for example, that because there was this unit that was created in the presidency, suddenly as a country, we were able to get to a point where electricity supply was stabilized. We were suddenly able to get to a point where the visa reform space had been really, there'd been good momentum there. We suddenly saw the port activities and the problems on our logistics infrastructure and the port performance being stabilized. Now we're looking at version 2 of Operation Vulindlela, and the presidency with version 2 of Operation Vulindlela mentioned that whilst they're still going to accelerate private sector investment in those types of infrastructure, water, electricity, logistics, transport, ports, etc. There's also suddenly a big focus on spatial imbalances that exist in South Africa, with the presidency saying they are going to look at how to address spatial transformation. They're going to look at title deeds and why we're having issues around ownership in the title deed system. They're going to look at release of publicly owned properties and what can be done, particularly in the inner cities around that. So I think I'm particularly excited by the fact that this is suddenly on Operation Vulindlela's agenda, because if we can get it right, I think it unlocks so much more for us as a country. Yeah.
Now we know that access to finance, I mean, you go anywhere where you put more than one, black player in the property space in a room, and in no time, access to finance is going to be the thing that, comes up. Outside of raising, capital, there's also then the equity, stake and all of that. Yeah. So we consider access to finance as one of the blockages, to getting into property. How much of players out there, and I mean, you may not know the exact numbers, actually are able to access, private equity in funding some of their projects? And if the number is little, especially if you don't, you're not in these big corporates, the smaller guy, the small, medium enterprise, how can they find themselves getting, a piece of that action?
Yeah, it's not enough. There really, in my mind, isn't enough capital that is going in at the levels needed. Yeah. And I say that because I think traditional debt, we've seen that it does what it needs to do. Yeah. And it's actually gotten us very far as a country. The banks have gotten us very far as a country.
There's an ABSA bank, you walk and you see it and you just go in.
Right. So there's a place for traditional debt, senior debt funding. We certainly do still need more private equity and risk capital in the property space, and particularly backing transformed and emerging developers and investors. And I say that because I was fortunate to also spend some time in one of the housing financiers in our country, one of the biggest ones that intervenes in the affordable housing space. And one of the biggest constraints we could see there was that we just were not seeing a good pipeline of projects that were backed by experienced Black developers.
Sure.
So if I unpack that, for me, what it says is, there's clearly a role for incubation. Fine, granted, there's a role for incubation.
Yeah.
And that incubation would have to be targeted at making sure that developers don't only build up that track record, but also have liquidity to keep their businesses going when they're building that track record.
Okay.
Right? Because during that period, they don't have access to traditional funding. During that period when they are identifying land, trying to do land assembly, trying to get rezonings, trying to determine whether or not there's infrastructure available.
Yeah.
They are engaging with municipalities. Municipalities are taking months and years. They need liquidity. So there's certainly a need for capital there in that project preparation phase, and for working capital for developers to get their projects to a point where they then become bankable, and they can then knock on the doors of your private equity players. Because if you think about where the private equity players are getting their money, it's pension funds.
Yeah.
And so it's not always going to be possible for them to put pension fund money and have it out there for years and being used for such risky endeavors.
Sure.
So that, in my mind, is an area where the state needs to be more efficient, so that approvals get done quicker.
Yeah.
Service determination gets done quicker. Service agreements get done quicker. Get done quicker. Because when you do that, you reduce the developer's timeline and you make it easier for that developer to go to a private equity company to say that I'll have this thing ready and bankable in such and such a time. So they're able to then unlock private equity much quicker, and the risk is reduced materially. So that for me is really what needs to happen. It's project preparation funding. It is patient capital, because we know how long it takes to prepare projects to get them to bankability. And then once they're bankable, it's also more institutions that provide private capital or private equity into deals. A lot of our institutions are providing senior debt, but we know that we've got an equity nightmare for a lot of developers.
Yes. literally stuck and not in a position to move forward, sitting with, senior debt approved, or rather, pending naturally. So that capital equity to unlock that development. Are there any misconceptions that you think we generally have, when it comes to private equity?
I know what misconceptions I had, so I can share those with you. I think the misconceptions I had, and this is many, many years ago when I was in banking, and there was this unit that sat there that I was told does private equity. And I would think to myself, what do they do? So it seemed like quite an opaque kind of area where nobody knows what they do. And so I think over time, having had the privilege of being exposed to the space, one of the biggest misconceptions is that I think a lot of people don't understand that at its simplest level, it is capital that is invested in businesses and enables those businesses to grow. Of course, there's nuances in that capital is looking for a return. That capital must exit at such and such a time because that money must be returned back to our pensioners, right? There's nuances around what the mandate of that fund is in terms of where it can invest, what it can't invest. There's nuances around the fact that because that money has to earn a good return, that must be returned back to pension funds. The type of businesses that it invests in have to have high growth potential. In the case of private equity, they have to be revenue producing, profit producing businesses. But in the instance of venture capital, which comes in at an earlier stage in the life cycle of a business, it doesn't necessarily have, that business doesn't necessarily have to be generating a profit yet, but certainly it must have done a lot of work in terms of it now has a product, it has a market, it is generating revenue, etc. So I do think that another big misconception is that a lot of businesses don't know how they have to prepare themselves to be able to access private equity. And that's quite important because it's money that has to go into a business that has come some way in terms of proving its product, proving its market, having some corporatization happening in that business, etc., before that money can flow into it.
And we always talk about, our state of readiness to be able to access opportunity, access money, and really just selling our product or our business or our ideas. So what is that posture? How should a business position itself to be able to attract, private equity funding?
I think firstly, the business or the entrepreneurs must do their research. Because it really does go a long way to, as an entrepreneur, if you know, for example, that for my business, this is my target market. Because if you've got over 100 PE funds that can invest in different types of businesses, it means in a given day, those fund managers are getting how many applications? Or how many proposals? So you need to then, as an entrepreneur, make sure that firstly, you're knocking on the right door. And you're knocking on the right door because you have gone on the SAFKA website, you have clicked on the database, you have seen who are these fund managers, you've gone on their websites to see what types of deals they're investing in. So you've got a sense of what sectors they seem to be interested in. Are they investing in early stage businesses? Are they investing in mid-sized businesses or large? Are they investing in property or retail sector or tech sector? Also, you must do your research, I would say. And then I think also as a property developer, or think about what role you want your private equity investor to play.
Okay.
In that, firstly, know that you must have done some work.
Sure.
And by that, I mean pre-feasibility work. So you must have done the conceptual designs. You must have gotten the rezonings. You must have tested what the infrastructure state is for that piece of land, gotten the planning approvals, etc. Because by its nature, a private equity fund has to deploy quickly because that enhances its returns. So they can't come in at a stage where you're still trying to bring this thing and pull it together.
Yeah.
And secondly, you must put yourselves in their shoes in terms of saying, if a private equity investor takes on or they acquire a stake in this business, in this project, in this development, what does the exit look like for them? Because remember, they must exit.
Yeah.
In maximum 10 years, they must be able to either sell their stake in the business or sell the business or have that interest kind of reduce over time. So put yourself in their shoes as well in terms of thinking, what kind of exit mechanisms might there be for them?
Yeah. Okay. So there are all of these stages, right, that you would need to have gone through. I know earlier we touched on, what part of the requirements to make a development possible on infrastructure.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at infrastructure, and we certainly know the state of South Africa. I think if you look at even the old townships, right, that the infrastructure was just not built, for the growth that it has seen in the last couple of years. And in the planning for rolling out, more infrastructure, we seem to be, lagging behind and slowing down the potential of development in these areas. From where you said, what can be done, to actually drive infrastructure, to make development possible? I mean, one person mentioned in the inner city that they bought a building. And of course, they were coming, with investor funding, and they were selling, this beautiful dream of what this building, could potentially do. From what, he mentioned, then, COVID came, and that delayed, because we know that COVID, delayed a lot of plans. But when they went back, they found that, there was, like a sewer challenges and all of that. So the building itself was less attractive to, for anyone to move in, and stay there. And that points, to our ailing infrastructure, our what can be done, and is it municipalities? Is there a role that private sector, can play?
Yeah, I think it's a role that everybody. This problem is so big. It honestly cannot be left to a single entity, or a single organ of state, or a single department. And I say that because I think, firstly, if we look at the public sector, and I'll get to the private sector, if we look at the public sector, I think there's certainly a lot of coordination that needs to happen across the three spheres of government, then with government and agencies. So there's firstly coordination that needs to happen there, because I think there's a lot of inefficiencies that happen in that whole system. And
national has its own plan.
Everyone
Province
has their own plan. Sometimes they're not pulling in the same direction. And if we're talking about scarce resources, when you've got scarce resources, you must be targeted about your approach, which means there must be a plan that everyone is investing around, You can't have one pulling in that direction, one pulling in the others. So there's a lot of work that I think has happened around trying to drive that coordination, but I don't think we're there yet. There's a lot of work that has happened around streamlining of grants and how they flow into the provincial, then municipalities, metros versus others, etc. But I think ultimately where that money still gets invested doesn't follow one plan. Because what you want is, if we're going to prioritize a area or a geography or a corridor, then funds must go there, and build that corridor and make sure that infrastructure is efficient in that corridor. So if I were to take, say, an inner city environment as a strategic corridor, then that's where the bulk of our resources then should go to make sure that we get the infrastructure there to work, where it doesn't, and to make sure that we catalyze development there for the infrastructure that is underutilized, because there's a lot of that. And we make sure that we drive density there, because then with the higher densities, you then sweating your assets as much as possible. Right? So that's what I think needs to happen, firstly, to drive efficiencies in the municipal and in the local government, provincial and state space. But that being said, I do have a lot of sympathy for municipalities as well, because I think the reality is that municipalities, have quite a difficult balance to strike, in that they have to do two things. On the one hand, they have to deliver basic services and give people dignity. That means they must make sure that there are services that enable houses, schools, whatever to be built. So that's important. But at the same time, they, with the same level of importance, have to deliver economic infrastructure, because the roads are needed. The ICT is needed. The water is needed. That infrastructure is important because that's where the jobs get created. So you need both. And so you can't have municipalities that are just delivering free services, because that is unsustainable. So they need to strike that balance of how much of our budget goes into social services, how much of our budget goes into economic services, because you need the economic infrastructure, because ultimately it's a loop. Because with economic infrastructure, you bring in private sector investment. Private sector build the buildings, the properties, and how much is the property sector worth now? 6.3 trillion in South Africa. So you know that if you've got the services, private sector will come and they'll build an industry that is in the trillions, that creates jobs, that gives people income, which means those people can pay for the services, which means you get money as a municipality for your water, electricity. And so right now we are in a situation where this is not happening. The economic infrastructure is not happening, which means the municipality isn't getting income in. The property rate space is declining. The tariff revenue on water can't pay for the purchases on water, and there's water losses. The tariffs can't pay for bulk purchases on electricity, and there's losses that are happening there. So there's a lot that must happen around efficiency and around balancing social and economic infrastructure. That being said, there's a lot that we've done that has worked. So I think one of the things that we've seen in South Africa is that, firstly, because we are a country that has rule of law, this has enabled us over the years to deliver sophisticated, amazing infrastructure. I was in one of the African cities, I won't mention which one, 2 weeks ago, and it reminded me of how well South Africa is doing in comparison to other African countries when it comes to roads, good ICT networks, health infrastructure, education, infrastructure, etc. So there is some good that has been done. But where we've got things that work, I think we must make sure that we really put impetus to them. We really make sure that they don't stop, start. We had a REAP program that did fantastically for our country in terms of introducing renewable energy and reducing our reliance on just coal-fired energy. We still need to do a lot of work there, but it was a system that worked, that brought in a lot of private sector capital to amplify what the state is doing. So where we've got things that work, let's get them right. Where we've got PPPs that work, let's make sure that we don't frustrate them. Let's make sure that we reduce the red tape, we make it not so overly complex for PPPs to be done.
Yeah.
Because money is sitting in the private sector. If you look at the private capital industry right now, when we looked at what percentage of the assets under management are actually going into infrastructure, it was over 40% of private capital that is currently being invested in infrastructure. However, if you look at what kind of infrastructure is investing in, a lot of the time it is infrastructure that ultimately is almost de-risking things for business.
Okay.
Because they're saying
limiting reliance
we now have a state that's not giving us stable power, stable water, And
so now we are creating our independence from it.
Right. So it's great because it's keeping our economy going.
Yeah.
But it's not the ideal. Yeah. So the issue isn't that the money's not there.
It's just being refocused, so that we can stand.
What can the state do to make sure that the money goes where it's needed the most?
Oh my goodness. So for someone who is looking to access private equity, and yes, I hope that they they must actually visit the SAFKA website and look at, what the players that are there and what spaces they're interested in. But are there any, platforms that they can make themselves, available to physically, so that they're able to, interact with, equity, private equity funders, managers, and just go out and do that research.
Yes. So I would say that, so SAVCA also we do a lot of networking events.
Okay.
I mean, some are targeted mainly for our members.
Yeah.
Where we try and bring them together with policymakers, or we bring them together into that space with investors, potential investors, etc. But there are others where we actually open them up to the public.
Okay.
Where if you're an entrepreneur or you're a business owner that is wanting to bring private equity, a private equity partner in, go there, attend those events. Be on our database so that you know what we've got on our calendar.
Okay.
And you are then able to tap into those networks. I think it's also important to be close when you're an entrepreneur or a business owner, be close to incubators and accelerators as well, because they will also kind of share a lot of information around the industry.
Okay.
What private equity fund managers are looking for, how you can position yourself properly for them. So be close to incubators and accelerators. Yeah. I think stay close to also like LinkedIn. A lot of the fund managers, actually all of them are active on LinkedIn. All of them have websites. Connect with them, Connect with them for a conversation. Stay close to other industry bodies as well, because what you'll find is that your private equity real estate fund manager is also a SAIBPP member.
Yes.
They are also a SAPOA member, right? So they are at SAIBPP events. They're at SAPOA. In addition to SAFKA events, they're at SAIBPP events, they're at SAPOA events. They are at the South African, what's the shopping center council? They are at those events. So there are so many platforms where you can actually connect with them. Use those platforms.
Okay. And I think what I love about today's conversation is really just, pointing out that there are mechanisms out there, if you just get yourself funding ready, do the research, invest in yourself as a business, so that when you meet them at these platforms, you at least, have some idea of who you are, of what you want, the posture of your business and the interventions, that you want from them.
Yeah.
So I think as we move towards closing, from infrastructure, innovation around infrastructure. And I know you went to this, country, and I'm glad that South Africa is doing better because there are some, even in the African continent that are actually doing a lot better than what South Africa, is doing. But in terms of innovation, are there any regions or countries that, you think South Africa could learn from? Without, and I know that we all think that mine is the best, mine is the best. South Africa does it well. I've seen, I haven't really taken the time to study them, but from what I've seen, places like, I think Rwanda seems to be doing, quite well.
Yeah.
I don't know what they are doing, better than what we are and what we can learn from them. And you still find that there are, players in the property space who are venturing out into other African countries, where I guess for a number of reasons, it may not even necessarily be infrastructure or innovation around, solving for that, but they just are more attractive for development than what South Africa is.
I don't have a single country that comes to mind, but a couple. So if I look at what I think would have worked in some of the countries that are, in my mind, good case studies for infrastructure that works, what I think they have gotten right is that, firstly, the basics work. So we need to get to a point where the basics work in our country.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so simple and yet it's so complex.
No, I think we also allow mediocrity.
I agree.
No.
And we clap for, doing what we should be doing. Let's
get the basics to work. Let's get potholes to get filled. Let's get traffic lights to work. Let's get public infrastructure to not operate like they are gangsters. So let's get the basics to work through law and order and through just delivering basics as a country. But for that to work, it means we must get our municipalities to work. And I think this is something we just don't spend enough time on in South Africa, in that I feel like we fundamentally don't realize that if our municipalities don't work, nothing works. So the most important thing we can do is get our municipalities to work. And for those municipalities to work, obviously there's a number of elements to it. It's resourcing. It is making sure that you've got technocrats who are professionals and not political appointees. It is making sure that municipalities are not pulled in different directions and have a plan and they work in accordance with that plan. It is holding them accountable in terms of turnaround times on things. So there's a lot that can happen there which actually doesn't involve money. So let's get our municipalities to work. And then I think let's also, and I said this before, we've got stop-start projects that are good projects. So for example, if you look at some countries that have managed to get their transport infrastructure funded, they did that because they had a plan that they followed around driving transit-oriented development. And that was a plan and they stuck to that plan. And they said, we are going to make sure that in our environment, given what we're seeing around migration, given what we're seeing around the need for sustainability and for us to have higher densities, given what we're seeing around a fiscus that is constrained and the need to look at innovative funding mechanisms such as value capture, we are actually going to do TOD. we do a stop-start where 1 year we are putting out bids for station development, and then the next, nothing's happening. So I do believe that where we've got programs that work, we need to actually just keep them sustainable. And those programs, it's getting PPPs to work and having them not complex. It is getting value capture mechanisms around transit-oriented development to work and making sure that that happens. It is when we've got programs such as REAP and others that unlock renewable energy, let's get those to work and not others. And ultimately, I think it is also around being a state that is business friendly. And business, not just our own business, but foreign business as well, and foreign investor friendly. Because when you've got an unstable environment, capital flows out very quickly. Because they're worried about what the future of that is gonna look like. And the reality is that right now in South Africa, we've got a situation right now where whilst a lot of our infrastructure has thankfully been funded by international DFIs, they have a mandate to play, and South Africa is not their mandate. Their mandate is impact, which means they will look for impact in South Africa and anywhere else. So 1 year South Africa might be a good impact story. The next it might not. They will go where with what aligns with their mandate. So we need to get to a point where we create a stable environment for foreign capital to flow in, but at the same time we create an environment that unlocks local institutional capital, so that when foreign capital flows out, we are not left stranded. We've got trillions of pension fund money that currently isn't going into our infrastructure, isn't going into our hospitals, into our schools, into affordable housing. And we must unlock that. We must create mechanisms for that to be unlocked. And in my mind, that is through really promoting and driving private capital.
My goodness. Okay, so as we close, we always end with a question from the last guest that we hosted. And I think you've actually, touched on it in your last answer, that in a politically, volatile or uncertain environment, how do we ensure that there's sustainability in what we are doing?
We have this plan that we were told is going to drive our growth for the years to come. When last did we open that plan? And when we are investing, moving ahead, are we actually measuring ourselves against that plan? So I think we need to actually be deliberate in tracking our progress against that plan.
So then having a plan that stands regardless of who
We've got a national
is in
development
leadership.
plan, which must live and outlive whoever is in government. It must outlive whoever's in government, and whoever is in government at a point in time during their tenure, they must be measured around what is it that they're doing and how is it contributing to that NDP that we drafted many, many years ago. And I think in addition to that, what I think we all need to do is we must accept that for South Africa to continue to be competitive to foreign investors and everybody else, whilst we are fixing our problems that I mentioned, we must also be thinking about industries of the future. We must be thinking about how the role that digitization plays and can play in solving a lot of our problems. If you look at what's happening in the venture capital space, a lot of the problems that VCs are solving are actually societal problems, but we're not putting a lot of focus around innovation and how innovation can solve our societal problems. We're not putting a lot of emphasis around sustainability and how forget the fact that we are always going to need coal-fired power stations.
Yeah.
We can't run away from that, but we certainly cannot be putting up buildings as if we don't have infrastructure problems. You know, so the buildings that we put up must evolve.
My goodness. Well, that was our conversation for today, and I learned quite a bit. I hope that you did as well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and continue to follow our channel so that you get exposed to these conversations. Thank you and goodbye.